They brought me into a dimly lit holding room tucked behind the courtroom, where the walls felt like they were closing in. Cold. Quiet. Sterile. I was told I had to be processed before my scheduled appearance, whatever that meant. I sat in the chair they pointed to. No cuffs, but I didn't move. Not until the door opened again and a correctional officer stepped in. Tall, pale, with close-cropped hair and a heavy badge on his chest. He didn't introduce himself. He just walked straight toward me, pulling out a pair of electric clippers from a pouch on his belt like it was just another day. Policy, he muttered flatly, without looking me in the eye. All detainees must be clean-cut before stepping into the courtroom. I stared at him, silent. Gotta shave your head, he added, already reaching for my shoulder. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just nodded once, slow. Let him think whatever he wanted to think. Let him feel in control. My gray dreadlocks fell strand by strand onto the floor as the buzz of the clippers filled the room. He smirked as he worked, maybe thinking he was breaking me down somehow. But I was counting the seconds, not because I was scared. Because I knew what was coming next. When he finished, he didn't say a word, just tapped the clippers against the side of the chair and gestured toward the door. I stood up slowly, feeling the cool air brush against my now bare scalp. He walked behind me, close, like I was some sort of threat that might bolt. The hallway was narrow and hushed, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears. We passed other officers, none of them bothering to look twice. Just another detainee. Just another case file in motion. As we approached the double doors of courtroom 3A, I could hear the muffled chatter of lawyers and spectators already inside. The officer placed his hand lightly on my back and leaned in. "Try not to embarrass yourself in there," he said under his breath. "You'll be out of everyone's way soon enough." I turned to him, locking eyes for the first time. My face was unreadable. I gave him the faintest smile. Not cruel. Not kind. Just calm. He didn't understand it. Not yet. The courtroom doors swung open. The bailiff inside blinked when he saw me. Then blinked again, like his brain needed to recalibrate. Because the woman they'd brought in under escort wasn't supposed to be walking toward the defendant's table. She was heading straight for the bench. Whispers fluttered across the courtroom like a wave breaking. The clerk looked confused. The attorneys froze mid-sentence. Even the court reporter's fingers hesitated above her keys. The correctional officer behind me was still walking, still guiding, until he realized I wasn't slowing down. I stepped past the defense table. Past the prosecution. Straight to the raised bench. I reached behind the desk and picked up the black robe folded neatly on the side. Slipped it on without hurry. No theatrics. Just routine. Then I took my seat in the judge's chair and adjusted the microphone. Silence hit the room like a dropped gavel. The officer was still standing near the center aisle, clippers at his side, mouth slightly open. He looked like he'd been unplugged from reality. I cleared my throat. "This court is now in session," I said. My voice was calm. Collected. Cold as steel. Every head turned toward me, but I was already looking at the man who had shaved my head just minutes earlier. I saw the exact moment it clicked. The widening of his eyes. The shift in his stance. His grip tightening around the clippers, as if that tool had given him some kind of power. Not anymore. The court officer by the door cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to smooth things over. "Your Honor, we didn't realize, there must have been a mix-up in intake." I raised a hand. Just a small gesture. He stopped mid-sentence. "No need to explain," I said coolly. "The system doesn't make mistakes. People do." I turned my attention back to the correctional officer. He still hadn't moved. Still gripping the clippers like they might rewind time. "Officer," I said, "please step forward." He hesitated, then obeyed, mechanically, like someone dreaming with their eyes open. "What is your name?" I asked, even though I already knew it from the badge he wore with so much pride earlier. "Martin," he replied, voice dry. "Officer Troy Martin." "Troy Martin," I repeated slowly, letting the name settle in the air like dust. "Did anyone inform you who I was before you escorted me into that holding room?" He glanced around. The walls were closing in now. "No, ma'am. I mean, Your Honor. I was just following intake protocol." "You were following routine," I replied. "But without the decency to ask a single question before putting your hands on me. Or a razor to my head." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I leaned forward, just slightly. "There will be a hearing," I said. "Not tomorrow. Not next week. Right here. Today. Because you didn't just overstep, you humiliated an officer of the court, a sitting judge, under the false belief that she didn't matter." Troy Martin looked like the ground might open up beneath him. And in that moment, every eye in the courtroom saw exactly what I wanted them to see: power taken is nothing. Power reclaimed, that's justice. The courtroom remained frozen. You could hear the hum of the ceiling vent. The scratch of someone shifting in a seat. But no one dared speak. I motioned to the bailiff. "Escort Officer Martin to the witness stand," I said. "He'll be answering questions under oath." The color drained from his face. "Wait, Your Honor, I didn't know," I raised the gavel. "You didn't ask. You didn't care." The bailiff approached him, and without resistance, Officer Martin stepped toward the stand. His steps were heavy, uncertain. He sat down slowly, his posture shrinking by the second. It was a stark contrast to the man who had stood over me just minutes earlier, buzzing my head like it was nothing. I turned to the courtroom gallery. "Before we proceed," I said, "let the record show that this court does not exist for show. It exists to protect the law, and the dignity of every person within it. Regardless of appearance. Regardless of assumptions." Somewhere in the gallery, someone murmured a quiet "Amen." I didn't acknowledge it, but I heard it. I looked back at Martin. "You're under oath. You'll speak the truth. And the truth only." He nodded stiffly. "Now," I said, "walk me through every step of your actions this morning, from the moment you received your assignment, to the moment you put those clippers to my head." His hands were trembling. His voice cracked. And the lesson was only just beginning. Officer Martin sat on the witness stand, suddenly small beneath the polished oak and centuries of justice behind me. His mouth opened, then stalled again, like his brain couldn't decide where to begin. "Start with the briefing," I instructed. "Who gave you your orders?" He swallowed. "Sergeant Miller handed me the intake list. Told me to process detainee, female, mid-50s. Said she was already in holding and needed to be court presentable." "Did anyone tell you she was a judge?" "No, Your Honor," he said quickly. "The list didn't say that. It just had a name, S. Daniels. No title." The courtroom stirred. I nodded. "And what exactly does court presentable mean in your department?" Martin hesitated. "It's discretionary. Some officers interpret it as grooming. Clean clothes, shaved hair if needed." "If needed?" I echoed. "You decided a head full of dreadlocks was not acceptable." His lips parted, but no words came. "You made that call. No inquiry. No confirmation. No consideration that the woman sitting before you might not have been an inmate at all, but a presiding judge of this courtroom." "I thought I was doing my job," he muttered. "No," I said sharply. "You were doing what you assumed was acceptable. You acted without fact, without permission, and without respect." The silence that followed was suffocating. "I'll ask one more question," I said, leaning forward. "Why did you smirk?" His eyes snapped up to mine, panicked. I didn't. Yes, you did, I cut in. You wore a grin while stripping a woman of her identity. It wasn't policy. It was power. He looked like he might fall apart. And he wasn't the only one squirming. Everyone in that courtroom, from the lawyers to the spectators, had just watched a symbol crumble under the weight of its own arrogance. I let the silence sit. It needed to. The air was thick with something more than discomfort, something heavier. Truth. Martin didn't speak. He couldn't. His hands were clamped together now, resting on the edge of the stand, as if bracing himself against what he already knew was coming. Officer Martin, I said evenly, you are suspended from courthouse duty effective immediately, pending a formal review. Gasps rippled through the room. But I wasn't finished. This court will be submitting a full report to the Department of Correctional Oversight. Not just for your conduct, but for the environment that allowed it, unchecked, unquestioned. He dropped his head. I stood. My voice echoed from the bench with new gravity. This is not about vengeance. This is about accountability. Because every time someone uses a uniform to act on assumption instead of fact, trust dies a little more. And this courtroom runs on trust. Then I looked out at the room, at every eye that had watched me walk in that morning bald, in silence, thinking they knew what they were looking at. I sit here today not in shame, but in full clarity. You saw a woman stripped of her hair and her identity. But let me remind you, my authority never lived in either. A few people stood, slowly, and began to clap. Not loudly. Not as celebration. As respect. And still, Martin sat, staring down at the floor. He had nothing left to say. The gavel hadn't even fallen yet, but the sentence had already arrived. The applause faded on its own, quiet, solemn. No one dared speak out of turn. I took a breath and placed the gavel back in its cradle. I didn't need to use it. Not that day. The clerk stepped forward with the next docket, but I held up a hand. Court will recess for 15 minutes, I announced. Everyone, take a moment. Not for me. For what just happened here. The courtroom slowly began to empty, conversations hushed, minds heavy. I watched Officer Martin being escorted out, not in handcuffs, but not as a free man either. He wasn't facing prison. But he'd carry this moment longer than any sentence. Once the room was nearly clear, I finally stood and walked toward the back hallway. A female bailiff caught up with me, eyes full of apology. Judge Daniels. I'm so sorry. None of us knew. I placed a hand on her shoulder. I know. And that's the problem. She lowered her gaze, nodding. Inside my chambers, I stood before the mirror. My reflection was unfamiliar, bare scalp, lined face, unflinching eyes. They had taken my hair, yes. But they couldn't take the bench. Couldn't take the robe. Couldn't take the law that stood behind me. Sometimes, power reveals itself not in what you say, but in how you survive what was meant to humiliate you. And when I walked back into that courtroom 15 minutes later, I didn't need to reclaim anything. Because I never left the seat.